Chairman Setzler, members of the committee, thank you for having us here today. I'm John Hevener. I am the president of the Georgia Retail Association. The doctor's comments may have been just perfect because it may have delayed us our AV needs just right on time. I'll make a qualifying statement first off. I'm not an expert on RFID. And there's a chance today you may ask some questions I may not have answers for today. If you and your staff and I try to capture those questions, I'm sure I can get you answers by your next meeting on 11/29, however. So if we have those numbers or those questions, I would like to answer them for you. First of all, the comments I'm making are also on the handout that I gave you. It's a PowerPoint, and we'll see what we can do. I got this really nice mouse here. Okay. The Georgia Retail, don't know why I've got that, but... How do I use this to go down? Hit the space bar in there? Oh, it just has it there? Okay. All right. We do represent an industry in Georgia which is starting to use biometrics, and it's a rather large industry. We have 75,000 retail establishments in the state and more than 715,000 people working in that industry, which represents 1 of 5 working Georgians. Also, the sales to the state were $116 billion in 2005. So we are a major segment of the state's industry, and I think that's a good thing to think of as we go forward. Here's the way retail is growing in Georgia. It continues to grow. A lot of us who've done some economic analysis think retail is what's pulled Georgia out of the doldrums after 9/11, and really has helped Georgia get back on its feet economically through both the sales tax and the income tax paid by employers of retail workers. Here's some real quick statistics on retail, and we'll move right into the topic matter. 95% of retailers in the state do have just one location. 90% have sales below $2.5 million, 98% have less than 100 workers, and 55% of the retailers in Georgia actually have less than 4 workers. Now here's why we're involved at all in biometrics. The retail industry has a huge loss of money every year in shrinkage. And shrinkage means loss of goods by many different ways. It means employee theft, it means shoplifting, it means inventory control. But the thing I want to basically draw your attention to here is that 31.7% of retail losses, or $9.7 billion across the country, happens because of shoplifting. And most of the biometrics used in retail are associated with that. Now, as you have heard today, biometrics is an automated method of recognizing a person based upon physiological or behavioral characteristics, and retailers, like I said, have started to use these. The biometric technologies are becoming the foundation of an extensive array of highly secure identification and personal verification solutions. And those personal verification solutions are the part that's valuable to retailers. As the level of security breaches and transaction fraud increases, we feel a real strong need for a secure identification and personal verification technology to be in place in retail establishments that actually have the ability to put them in place. Let me see if I go up one. I went down one too far. No, biometric solutions provide confidential financial data, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail on that in a few minutes, and also personal data privacy. As you heard today, there's a lot of use of biometrics at the federal level, some use at state level, some use by local level, and a lot in military, and more every day now in commercial applications. Now, here's an issue I know you're talking about today, and we have the same concern you have. That trust in electronic transactions is essential for the healthy growth of the economy. I mean, everything we buy today, we buy electronically, whether it's from when you get your credit card approved at the gas station, your purchase approved at the department store, or whether you buy something online, that's all electronic. And we are in an electronic age, and honestly, I don't think there's any way we can turn that back. That train has left the station, and we're in that age. Now, alone or integrated with these technologies, some things we're seeing now in biometrics are smart cards, and you probably all have seen or know of a smart card, encryption keys, and digital signatures. And this is going to become a pervasive part of our economy. And for that reason today, we were happy to accept your invitation to come and talk. Now, using biometrics for personal authentication has become both convenient and it actually is more accurate and safer than things such as pins. Yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Hebner. Well, I'm not sure I'm clear on smart cards. I might know, but I'm not sure that I do.
Smart card is a card with a chip embedded in it. And the chip would give you some different information. The information may be your account number. It could be more, or it could be more than that. But basically, it would at least be an account number in all cases.
Trying to understand what other things could be in there.
Well, I don't think anyone else in retail is using it now, but it could have any of your personal data. It could have your name, it could have your birth date, it could have your address, it could have anything you have given to the people who use that PIN number.
Bank account.
It could. Yeah, generally it's kept separate from that, but it could. Yeah, in theory it could have that. It could even have a Social Security card number if you gave that to somebody and they were using that technology. I know of no one that's doing that, but it's capable of having that information.
How is that different from a magnetic strip that ties to? I'm not really sure I know what's in a magnetic strip.
And again, I'm not the expert on this, but I think what a magnetic strip holds is much less sophisticated than a chip that's in a smart card. The smart card actually has a chip.
It has a much larger volume of data that can be held in a chip versus a magnetic stripe.
Exactly.
And the accessibility of it, depending on the type of chip, is whether you have to have actual physical contact with the card to read the data. A magnetic stripe, you would have to have physical contact between the reader, the reader and the card. Whereas, depending on the type of smart card, it can be read in proximity.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about earlier, if you had a reader at the door here, it could pick up the identity of those walking in. So, being in the technology field, I do have some knowledge on some of this.
I am so thankful for that explanation. Thank you so much, Representative Loudermilk. I do appreciate it. Much better than I could have done. Okay, well, biometrics, it links an object or a person to a specific identity. I'm sure if any of you ever have stood in line at a ATM machine and sort of had somebody standing too close over your shoulder. We've heard of people using binoculars and other devices to steal PIN numbers. People have used electronic devices to steal PIN numbers. Much of biometrics actually can take that risk away, and rather than being a security risk, it's a security enhancement. I hope that's what I can show you today. And the other thing is, I don't know if you've ever forgotten your number. I've had days when I've actually thought of a phone number or a PIN number and just have blanked for at least a moment, and sometimes longer than a moment. With biometrics, you don't forget your finger or your eye or whatever it is you're using that day to take a measurement of who you are. Now, this is an interesting statistic. 6% of today's companies are using biometrics, and that's not just retailers, that's everybody. So it's really not a pervasive practice yet, but it is growing. And I do think in most of the biometric tools we're going to look at today, Europe and some of the Asian countries are leading the United States. Their technology's advanced from ours, and we are actually way behind the rest of the world in using biometrics. Now, I want to spend a few times in talking about specific biometric modalities, what's being used, how it's being used, and for the most, to my ability, what we know about the use of that. And like I say, it is limited, so please bear with me, and we'll get through this. Fingerprint. First of all, the fingerprint's probably the most commonly used one right now by people in retail, and it's not being used a lot. It's not being used extensively, but a few people use it. I have a member who owns one single grocery store who does a lot of banking with Hispanics. They actually come to his store to do their check cashing. The fingerprint ID for him is invaluable. It's just a resource he uses to ensure the validity of people who have poor English skills, a poor understanding of our system, and yet still can have safe and secure and reliable ID. So the advantages of fingerprints are, one, subject to have multiple fingers. You can use any one of 10 fingers. It's easy to use with some training, and the training is very, very simple training. Requires very little space. I have a picture in a few minutes of one of the systems they use. It takes very little space in the retailer. Large amounts of existing data allow a background and or watch list checks. And a watch list check is if you have somebody out there conning the system. A watch list check just lists you as a person to be suspicious. It's sort of like, you know, when police pull you over for an infraction along the road, they do a real quick check on you to see if you're a suspicious character. Some of these systems have that kind of safety nets built in, so if somebody has been conning the system or trying to override systems, this helps helps overcome that. Now, the other thing about fingerprints, they've proven useful for over 100 years. We've been using fingerprints for a long, long time. It's safe. It's reliable. Each fingerprint's unique. None of us, even exact twins, have some dissimilar characteristics in their fingerprints. Now, there are some disadvantages. First of all, a lot of folks don't like to give their fingerprints. I gave a fingerprint many, many years ago when I was in the Army, and I always wonder where that fingerprint is today. It's somewhere out there floating around. And thank God I haven't been fingerprinted since then for anything I've done, so I'm happy about that. There was a job I considered taking where I would have had to have a clearance, where I would have had to give fingerprints up, but had I taken that job, I would have gladly done that. Now, privacy concerns of criminal implications, some people think that if they have their fingerprints put down, it makes them a suspicious character. There's some health concerns by touching a sensor or a pad to record a fingerprint. Some people don't want to have physical contact with something somebody else has touched. A collection of high-quality nail-to-nail images requires training and skill, but current flat reader technology is very robust. And in other words, what we're talking about, the systems that we're using now are ones you actually lay your finger on rather than ones you hold your hand against. There are some out there you actually just put your top of your hand against. I mean, technology is amazing what they've done. And sometimes a person's age or occupation can cause sensors to get an incomplete reading. People who do jobs and use lots of abrasives can actually abrade their fingerprints where they're actually less visible. This is a machine that's being used in Georgia in a few locations today. It's from a company called Biometric Access. The system is one that really is used a lot for, like I say, financial transactions, and what we'll talk about in a few minutes is this has to be a live transaction. I'll get that. The keypad, a person puts their finger there. This machinery also has a small camera at the top, and that is capable of taking a face image at the same time to have a double security system put in place. Like I said, the system is being, to use the system, you first have to fill out an application. In other words, you have to agree to the process. It's nothing that you do randomly. It's a transactional procedure you agree to. The person is asked for an ID, and that ID can vary. It can be a Georgia driver's license, it can be a government-issued ID, or it can be an immigration card. Anything that gives you a reliable ID. Then, after they get the ID, the person puts their right or left index finger in the small part of the reader. The reader captures that fingerprint, and then the retailer scans or checks that fingerprint when a person comes in to cash a check. They check for a signature on the back of the check, and then they would take the fingerprint. A photo, like I said, doesn't have to be taken. Sometimes a photo can't be taken. The retailer that's actually using this system right now is not using photos. He's not capturing photos. It has the capability. He sees no need for it, but it has the capability if he wants to do that. Now, the advantage, this is new. That's the fingerprint. The next.
I have a question.
Sure. Yes.
On this system and the example you had given about the grocer who is using this, what type of responsibility, either legal or other, does he have, or systems in place to protect that data? Because he's actually acquiring some fairly sensitive data and keeping it online.
No, actually, he's not. That's actually said he doesn't have it online. I actually visited the site to make sure that it's a closed system. In other words, the system has no outside access line.
Okay. Well, I mean, online is being stored digitally
it is being
within
stored
system.
digitally in a computer, which is in a secure, locked room in the grocer's building. We'll go into this a little bit later. The question is, could somebody access that? Well, I guess anybody can access anything if they're good enough. The question is the utility of that data. I think I can answer that a little farther on, and if I don't, make sure we come back to it. But if you let me defer that answer a little bit, I'd like to, because there is a technology called Liveness, Liveness. That's what we'll talk about.
Another question, which you can defer that as well, if it's more or less a follow-on to that, is dealing with retention of that data.
Yep.
Is there any controls in place, either self-imposed or legislative, or anything that says how long will he keep this data acquired on an individual?
And I'm not an attorney, so I'm not sure if I can answer that question completely. I don't think there are any controls externally or legally. I think internally he would have his control would be as long as that's an active part of his system. None of us wants to store anything on our computers that has no utility anymore. That person's no longer a customer. you're automatically removed. If any of you have got a credit card from one of our retailers and haven't used it in a year, you go back and try to use it, there's a good chance you can't use it anymore. I find that happen to me all the time, and it aggravates me. But the thing is, they don't want to store data on us. Every time there's a cost of storing data, and people don't want data that they're not going to utilize in regular business transactions. In this case, if a person hasn't come in for a year or so and used that system, they're going to be cleaned out of the system because it's just slowing down the system, taking room on the system, and it's not being productive for that retailer's bottom line.
Well, there is a valuable aspect to having data too, and that's being able to provide that information to others, basically marketing that information. And that's, I think, one of the things that we're looking at is if I give some biometric information to the state, we do have some level of control to ensure that that's not going to be given to a third party. I'm not so sure that we have that in place to where if I go to this person's grocery store and I put my fingerprint down, that at some point when he goes out of business and he gives that system to somebody else, that data is still on there, and or his cousin wants to open a grocery store and he offers him a good deal to buy the data he already has, or a third party that just is a marketer of personal information will be able to acquire that. So that's one of the things. Maybe as we discuss further, we can get into some areas. But as we implement these new technologies, these are concerns that I'm having, and I know that others on the committee share as well.
And I know that's why you're here today. Actually, quite frankly, I will say retailers have a wonderful track record, a much better track record, for instance, in the federal government and protecting private information. Much better track record in some of the other major non-retail institutions in protecting private information. I think I will brag about my industry. We stand head and shoulders above the federal government in protecting private information, for instance. We've done a good job. Retailers are very sensitive to one thing. Customers vote with their feet. If you don't treat a customer right, if he doesn't feel like he can do business with you in a fair and honest manner, he'll go elsewhere. If we don't protect your data, you're going to go elsewhere. Plus, as we know, we're a very litigious society today, and people are going to sue you if I don't protect their information. So we're very sensitive to those issues you're bringing up. And not that we're perfect, but retailers have a really good record of taking care of those kind of things. I think we've done a pretty good job.
Mr. Hebner, if I could, I wanted to follow up. You and I spoke briefly last week as well. Just kind of, I speak personally to most of the folks that are coming to talk to make sure we're calibrated on terms of the topics, and you are spot on with what we wanted you to address. We talked last week about best practices, and it sounds like among your members in Georgia, we've got one grocer doing this, and it sounds like he's made the case that it makes sense for him and his business model. And in a broader, looking nationwide, what are best practices that are there retail chains in other states that have multi-locations that are doing this? And how are they using the technology? Because again, I don't know that the small grocer is going to be the model moving forward with respect to I collect the information at this ABC retail big box store, and there's 100 outlets elsewhere. It would seem that ABC Retail would want to share that among their outlets, so I could sign up at location in Smyrna, Georgia, and then be able to use it down in Bainbridge, Georgia, when I'm down there shopping. You'd think. Could you speak to that at all?
Well, I think as a physician who spoke about it, he spoke ahead of me today, said, many of this stuff is in the future. Right now, I don't know of any big boxes at all are using this kind of technology. In fact, I had to dig to find this case because I know you wanted to know what we were doing with it. It's not prevalent amongst retail now to use digital recognition or iris recognition or face recognition, but I'm trying to address that to the extent that we're utilizing it today. Probably some of your later speakers this afternoon in the banking industry and so forth would have much more knowledge about best practices across the country. It's an emerging science for retailers. The thing retailers using most are signature, and we'll talk about signature in a few minutes, are using signature verification predominantly.
Sure.
Very few are using anything else. Now, do I think they will start using some other things? Yes, and I'll get into that as well. But as far as the digital or iris or facial recognition, I don't think that's even 3 or 4 years coming. I think it's farther in the future than that.
And again, the charter of this study committee, as we've said earlier, and I know you were here from the beginning of the session today, we're looking to not address current issues. We're looking to get ahead of emerging issues to make sure that we're, if retailers have a demonstrable need to use technologies, that there's kind of handrails on that to make sure that we as a state don't fall off the rails and get into, and have retailers that are trying to do their job and trying to prevent theft, customers that are trying to get products at lower prices, faster through the line, all those things which are, I think we all agree, are noteworthy goals. I just think this committee's got some concerns that we get ahead of what current practice is. So I think as we contemplate the future and the shared information that we have, we think hard about the safeguards we'd need to have fingerprint shared from site to site on an online shared network, wide area network kind of thing.
Well, hopefully, as far as retail is concerned, I can assuage some of your immediate concerns and say, it used to be strategic planning was planning 5 years in the future. Now, a lot of folks say strategic planning is no good 5 years in the future. Well, I don't think this technology for retailers is even 5 years in the future. I think it's farther in the future. But having said that, we share your concern because we want to do it right. And retailers do want to do things right. They invest a lot of money in systems like this, want them to work well, want them to be secure, and want them to be cost effective. So we share your concern. The iris, the advantage of iris identification, there's no contact required. There's no touching a pad. There's no physical contact at all. It's a protected internal organ. It's less prone to injury, and it's believed to be stable throughout your lifetime. Now, a disadvantage, it's difficult to capture it in some people. They wear contact lenses. It's obscured by eyelashes, eyelids, reflections. Some people, there's a myth out there that if anything shines in your eye, it has a potential of blinding you, and people are afraid of iris, identification for that. It's completely a myth. The acquisition of an iris image requires more training than a fingerprint. And also, it takes more attentiveness and more skill on the person who's doing that operation. And then there's a lack of existing data that deters the ability to use for background or watch list checks. In other words, as far as we know, there's no list out there captured of irises that say this person's a crook. We don't know that list. And then they also cannot be verified by a human. Somebody can't look in your eye with a naked eye and say, you're who you are. I'm John Hebner and you're chairman, etc. They can't do that. The face, like I said, I know of no one in Georgia that's using facial recognition. It is a technology that's out there. I think some places in Europe are using this. The advantage is no contact required. It's a commonly used system. It's a camera. There are large amounts of existing images of us out there. I mean, I'm not sure how many images of you there are out there, but there are more of me than I would like to think about. And you being elected officials, there's even more of you all over the world and all over the papers and all over the archives. There's photos of us. And it's easy to identify a human, maybe not 100% accurately, but most of us look pretty much like ourselves and not anyone else. Disadvantages, well, faces can be obscured by hair, glasses, hats, scarves, and so forth. Changes in lighting, expression, and pose. Sometimes my driver's license looks like a completely different person than me. Face can change over time, aging, scarring, facial hair. Propensity for users to provide poor quality video images. The state loves to capture poor quality images. Just hold up your driver's license and see. So that's the disadvantage of facial recognition. A new one's coming out now. I don't know a lot about it, but they're, again, using this overseas, not in America. It's hand geometry, everything from your front of your hand to your back of your hand. Readers are actually reading your hand, not just a fingerprint, but a handprint. And Representative Loudermilk's shaking his head. Yes, he may know more about this than I do, but it is easy to capture.
I think Representative Loudermilk has a letter of palm readers in his district.
And this person's actually shown holding medications. There's a reason why I chose that slide, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But it's very stable. Your hand changes very little over the years. Disadvantages, it does require training to know how to read a handwrite. And it's not a palm reader, it's electronic. Some hands are not sufficiently distinctive for large databases. And then to capture all the data from a hand takes an immense database. It's not just as simple as a finger or a name or an address. It's a huge thing. Voice recognition. I know of no one in retail that's using voice recognition. Some research facilities use voice recognition. It's out there. It's fairly well accepted. There's no contact. And the technology exists readily. The disadvantages, difficult to control the sensor, and sometimes the wavelength that the voice is on can impact the recording from one place to another. And then again, a lot of voices sound somewhat alike. And unless you have high technology, it's not the best system in use. This is the most common one. I'm sure you've all used one in the last month. If you used a credit card in the last month, there's a good chance you signed a pad just like this. And this is the ubiquitous form in Georgia of biometric information capturing. This takes you do put your you put your name in there. Your name is captured. Your name's put into a system. It's not put into a system for any kind of a verification, which I thought it would be when I started researching this for the chairman. It's used only in there as a affirmation of contractual responsibility. In other words, they don't. When I go into Home Depot and write my name today, when I buy two gallons of paint, and go back Friday and use the same card and buy 4 2x4s and sign my name left-handed, the machine's not going to know it's not me. In other words, it doesn't contain that data. All it does is contains it, before it doesn't compare it, all it does is contains that to a record, a proof of purchase. So it's not sensitive, or it's not easily accessible or usable by anybody who wants to put that system. Now,
it isn't connected to the credit card company to verify the credit limit or allow that purchase.
The credit card company does not verify the signature; they verify the transaction.
Okay, they still verify the transaction.
Yeah. In other words, the signature.
And the signature is on file in case there's a.
But the personal identity of the signature isn't an issue. It doesn't match Calvin Hill this week with Calvin Hill last week. It makes sure you are pulling that card and that there's a signature. In other words, there's not a verification process in the computer in the store, right, a remote location that says these two signatures match. That doesn't happen.
Does it stay on storage in case there's a problem with that transaction and it needs to be compared at a later date?
Well, it's in there. It could be pulled up, but again, it could be a stolen credit card.
Yeah, at that time it could be brought up and
then it would be
compared.
brought up and not match. But there's no use of that to verify it pre-purchase.
Okay.
In other words, it's not a qualifier for the purchase. If that makes sense. It doesn't. I'm sorry.
It does, but it retains it.
Again, if any of you've been to Europe, you know that people in Europe are buying everything from sodas to clothing from machines using cell phones. Hasn't hit the United States yet. Some companies in New England are now starting this. I think within 3 to 5 years we'll see this in Georgia. So I think this is a technology this coming. Consumers are turning more and more to cell phones as information gathering tools with which they can get the latest sports scores, weathers, music, and videos. But it's not surprising to anybody now that they're using this technology to develop other ways of operating. And for us, the cell phones will become, we believe, an extended peripheral of retailing business. People can use their hands, handsets, and wallets to actually buy things online, buy things directly from the retailer. And you don't even need a terminal to do it. You can actually do it by phone. Now, Michigan, there is one retailer who's trying this as an experiment. Nobody in Georgia. But in Michigan, we have a gas retailer who actually is sending out via email every time gas prices go up. Anybody who's given him their number, he sends a text message out to them. And then after they get that message, the consumer has 2 hours to get to that gas station to buy gas. So you're saying, what's the significance of this? The significance of this isn't in Michigan that they were trying to deal with this high gas price thing we dealt with over the summer. Significance is we have a retailer who's communicating with people about items on sale via the phone. This is going to be the technology of the future, I think. And whether you like it or not, it's coming on. That's something we can deal with in a positive way. Now, just by using that phone, they can, and by permitting in advance, you have to sign up for this. It's nothing that you do, you're subjected to unless you are agreeing to this process. You can actually register to allow the store to send you messages, pre-authorize payment even before you get to the store. Hey, I'm coming to the grocery store, or I'm coming to the Home Depot. I want to authorize a purchase before I get there, right? That's your information in the computer. You walk in, show them your phone number. Your phone number actually connects, telephonically with the system there. It's paid for, gone. It's happening in Michigan now, and we think there's a good chance it's going to happen elsewhere, and probably eventually here in Georgia. There's not even need to check out. You just walk by your cart, your phone would send a message to the system there, and the sale would be complete. actually see it being used for things like sending you coupons. I'm not sure if you get email. Everybody gets email today. There isn't a day goes by that I don't get a coupon from somebody electronically. One of my good members, Best Buy, sends me coupons regularly, and I love them. And others send me coupons as well. So you're going to be getting coupons. You're going to shoot out messages to you about special sales, special promotions. It's going to be a way of communicating directly with the customer. The integrated systems will identify shoppers via their phone number and will automatically enable the merchant to offer items that are especially for them. So if you go to Kroger now, as I do, I'm a Kroger shopper. I have a Kroger Plus card, and Kroger, and I use it because I save money. But part of that deal was they know everything I eat, everything I drink, everything I use in my household that I buy from Kroger. They have a record of. I'm not worried about that. I'm willing to make the trade-off, the savings I get. Other stores in Georgia are doing the same thing. The same thing's going to happen with phones. If you agree to have your phone be part of a system, it's going to give you a financial benefit in return.
Mr. Hebner, and again, to these points, I just wanted to allay any concerns you may have. I mean, this committee is not principally concerned with emerging technology. This is not an emerging technology. Let's roll back. Let's go back to 1975 business practices. That's not the name of our committee at all. I mean, I think this. I'm speaking for myself here. I mean, I think the cell phone things you describe are exciting advances. I think the concern of the committee, just to reiterate, is the indelible, unchangeable nature of person's biometric information. I can never change my fingerprint. I can never change my iris. And if that information is made available to bad actors, that's, I think, the primary concern. Not that we have any concerns with it. And I know you've got, you're a strong advocate for the retail industry, and have some concerns when folks have concerns about potential uses and retail applications of technology. I wanted to say again, there's I think I can speak for the members of the committee that our chief concern is not emerging commercial practices. Like they know that Kroger knows that my wife orders, buys 90 diapers a week. That's fine for them to know. I think it's the issue of that indelible information that if it's compromised can never be changed. I can always change my cell phone number. I can replace my Kroger Plus card. I cannot change my fingerprint.
Right, and I'm almost to your point. Two more slides will be your point.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Go past that. And I will say it's all about extending convenience to our customers. People use systems to make their lives easier. Now they no longer are tied to their computers, but they'll have their phone or other device to help them be more efficient shopping. Now, the question we're getting to today, I think this is the bottom line for all of us, are biometrics safe to use? So first of all, biometrics are typically passive and just designed to be physically safe. I know it's not physical safety you're talking about, it's personal identity safety. It's only there too. Biometric systems usually implement ordinary computing and video technology, such as you have every day. We're on camera today, we're being recorded today. You had to go through a security system to get in here today. I had to show a photo ID to get in here today. So it's things I'm living with today. It's nothing new. Now, most of the systems out there use technology we're familiar with: a digital camera, sensors, and fingerprint sensing. Fingerprint sensing is roughly the same as touching a doorknob. Now, can anybody steal my biometrics? Now, this is a question you're worried about. It's possible to steal biometric information with certain modalities. For instance, this actually happened, I guess, one time. Somebody cut off somebody's finger and actually tried to use it to access a fingerprint system. I guess it's possible to do that. It's probably possible to create a synthetic iris, but it's not practical or realistic in most situations. We'll get there in a minute. This is why vendors are working on liveness detection. In other words, technology's not working. In other words, I cannot come in with a fake finger and put a fingerprint down to cash a check. I cannot come in with a fake iris and hold it up in a retail situation. Now you see these Mission Impossible type movies in a secure room where nobody's watching. You put a fake handprint up there or a fake eyeball up there and you walk in. Retail is live, person to person still. I don't see that changing. There's always going to be some personal eye-to-eye contact. And For that reason, if I have your fingerprint, if I have your iris print, if I have your retinal print, it's not going to do me much good in a retail situation because people are going to verify that I'm not holding somebody's eyeball in my fingers. I'm not holding somebody's finger in my hand. That sounds facetious, but I'm being quite sincere. It's hard to create fraud using this technology in a retail setting, especially with Now, why do we want to use biometrics? Because they are unique. They pass on identification. That's an intrinsic part of you. The part you're worried about, Sharon, is also the part that makes this valuable. If people think that smart cards, magnetic stripe cards, physical keys, and so forth are a lot safer than things like passwords and PIN numbers and so forth. And we think it's a much more secure way to do business. I have had a wallet lost in my lifetime. If you've ever had a wallet lost or stolen, it's quite a experience, not a good one. I'm more worried about losing my wallet than about taking my fingerprint, quite frankly. And I'm not trying to be naive about that. I really am. Now, we do think that it's much more secure than passwords, and unless you're truly a scientific evil genius, you're not going to be able to take this information and use it to any advantage in a retail setting. You just aren't. You're not going to crash anybody's system and steal lots of merchandise using a fingerprint taken off of some kind of electronic media, because you're going to present yourself to use that technology. That liveness is the issue in retail. I want to go really quick. This here, liveness detection is yours to ensure that only characteristics from a living human being can be enrolled, stored, and recognized in a biometric system. Liveness detection can be used to recognize spoof attacks, in other words, submission of false biometric information. Now, I think I was asked originally by Jennifer to talk a little bit about RFID, and I want to talk about RFID, but first of all, I want to say real quickly, RFID is not biometrics. It's a technology you're concerned with, but in no way is it biometrics. Unlike biometrics, RFID systems are not biologically linked to an individual. RFID is a technology that stores and retrieves data remotely through devices called RFID tags or transporters. So has no personal information at all. RFID tags, and I've actually used and seen the equipment, actually use radio frequency to exchange information. An RFID tag, as said earlier today by, I think maybe the gentleman from the ACLU, thank you, talked about they have a small antenna in them, and they do. The antenna has a electronic connection, either passive or active. Passive, there's no battery in the RFID, and most of them are passive. Some RFIDs are capable of having a battery or energy source inside. They're used right now. How many of you live up 400? If you do, the ePass tool is an RFID technology. Building access cards, RFID technology. Parking garage cards, today a lot of them are RFID technology. And RFID technology is starting to become into the retail world because of Walmart. Walmart's the one that said, we want to cut losses, we want to increase efficiencies, we want to use RFID as an inventory control mechanism. That's what it's for. Not a customer measurement mechanism, but inventory control mechanism. And unfortunately, what we've seen so far from the rest of the retailers, even Walmart suppliers, is a pushback on this because of the cost. Profits in retail are small. The average profit for a retail grocer is about $1.50 to 2 pennies on a dollar. RFID tags cost anywhere from 2 to 15 cents still, and right now RFID tag cost is a real issue for us and anybody who wants to use the technology. I do think, however, and I think anybody in retail would tell you that RFID will replace barcodes, and also they'll probably replace credit cards, because it's a technology that's really in the future. Now, not the same technology. The two won't be linked, but you're going to be using more sophisticated credit cards, more sophisticated product identification codes in the future. Now, RFID tags have the potential to make it exceptionally easy for companies to track inventory. And this is the real attractiveness. For instance, I'll tell you now, if an RFID tag is put on where a shirt is manufactured, when that shirt leaves that factory as part of a caseload of shirts, it's recorded, or can be recorded. When Walmart gets that shirt into their distribution center, it'll be recorded. When that shirt leaves the distribution center for a Walmart truck, it'll be recorded. When the shirt goes into the rear of a Walmart store, it'll be recorded. When that shirt comes from the storage in the back of the Walmart store to the Walmart floor, it'll be recorded. When it goes through the sale process, it will be recorded, and that's where it stops. No one's using that technology beyond the cash register today. In fact, the technology today won't even measure it within a couple feet. I mean, just beyond a couple feet. It isn't something that will measure at 100 yards or 50 yards or even 10 yards. It's a short distance identification process. Yes.
Mr. Evans, could you just fill me in? I don't, not sure I really know the details of what you're talking about. Are we talking about a tag on a shirt, or are we talking about something implanted within the shirt?
It could be either. Chips sometimes are implanted in things. Like right now, chips are mostly implanted in boxes of goods. In other words, if I have a box of 12 cartons of Tide to come through, each bottle of Tide doesn't have a chip. The carton does. So it's both. For the most part, chips are being used today on carton-sized goods, on multiple packed goods. It isn't being used today on like the tie I bought, or the pair of socks I bought, or the shoe I bought. Having said that, it is capable of being used there. It's capable of actually being attached to those because they're so small.
Is there any, on the retail side, on this retail sales inventory management side, is there any reason that the necktie that I buy, which comes with a little white tag and a little plastic strip that holds the tag to the tie, is there any reason that the RFID or the RF tag couldn't be on the RF transponder, the passive chip couldn't be on the tag instead of embedded in the product itself in a way that can't be removed?
Well, I think the issue for that is that it can't be removed is the whole issue. There's all kinds of retail fraud where people change tags. There are people called boosters, and I don't want to talk about too much. People who actually go into stores, steal large quantities of merchandise, change the tags themselves, and bring them back for refunds of things they were stolen. It's a billion-dollar industry in the United States, largely financed by organized crime and with money being funneled out of the United States into terrorist countries. It's proven. Having said that, I don't want to ring those those bells, but having said that, there are reasons for embedding it in the product, and basically that's for the security of the system.
Is there?
Where you will find these embedded in the product, I found one recently, is a lot of times in electronics, you will find electronic media, CDs, software. A lot of times the tag is inside the box. Recently, I can't remember what electronic device it was that I purchased, but being a tinker, I took the back off and I found the tag inside. I think it was a DVD player that you hook to your television. The RFID chip was actually on the inside of the case that most people wouldn't take off. So there are cases that might not be woven into the fabric of your tie, but in higher dollar items, a lot of times maybe on the inside of your television, the RFID chip is implanted inside the case, to where unless you took the case off, you wouldn't see it.
And there's a good case that wasn't actually RFID. There's a good case that was just an alarm tag that if it leaves the showroom floor without being paid for, it goes off.
Phil?
I think we digress. We're now talking into, and unless it's tied into biometrics here, and again, it's easy to go astray in this field because RFID tags, as you said, are not inherently tied into biometrics unless they're a type of tag. For some reason, somebody has input biometrics into it. So I think on retail purchases like this type of thing is really not applicable to this committee, if I may. And I know I'm going to have to leave very early, and I'm going to apologize to some of the other people. So I'd like to perhaps see if we can get it a tad back, more on focus. Not very interesting discussion, but I don't think it's totally, this part of it's totally applicable for this committee. And unless we're working on a type, as I mentioned, on an identification card where you had biometrics, your biometrics tied into the tag itself.
And Representative Hill, the only reason, and I thank you for your point, and I appreciate that. It's one of the things we said earlier in the committee meeting. I think the only reason I'm exploring it, and we might better do it offline, is the idea that products that people carry on their persons that have passive RFIDs in them, I know there's plans, ideas, fantastic though they may be in some people's minds, that if you have RFID in clothes and items that folks carry with them, folks are carrying a digital signature that they're not aware of themselves, that they walk past a shelf and Ed Setzler or they can track to a product number and a unique 38-digit unique identifier for the sport coat that I bought. Walked and looked at some high-priced perfume, so we're going to send them high-priced perfume coupons or advertisements. I know it sounds fantastic, but in effect what we're doing is having passive RFIDs that are on people's persons, unbeknownst to them, that they end up carrying around with them through their lives, and it becomes not an issue of an indelible biometric, but a personal tracking means and a means of watching. It's just an issue of personal information and whereabouts and being secure in one's person and effects.
Wearable biometric.
So I think that's the issue, and we can move on.
Yeah, no, it's up. I have as much or little as this as you want, and so I did it because you've asked me to. Basically, I think you're on target there. That's the biggest concern. The biggest concern is not in the stores, and quite frankly, technology doesn't exist right now to go ride by your house and tell you and give us an inventory of what you've bought because of RFID tag. Nor does the technology exist. I think it will be here eventually. That as you walk through the store, they'll say, "Oh, Ed Setzler, good to see you again. We have your Post Toasties on sale today on aisle 4 because I know you eat Post Toasties." That's coming. That's coming. Having said that, it's not here yet, but we're a long ways away from that.
Oh, right.
But let me just make a few comments, and we'll kind of sum up and see if you have any more questions. First of all, I have down at the bottom of my presentation a couple I want to just share with you, and we're almost there. Actually, I want to go. I missed one. The comment I wanted to make was, first of all, do biometrics invade a person's civil liberties and privacy? And this is a good question because of the first presenter we had today. And many U.S. Supreme Court decisions, including, I have a list of them in my presentation here today, have affirmed that biometrics do not invade an individual's civil liberties or privacy per se as they exist today. So I cautiously urge you to move forward on this, looking at both the legal ramifications, the business ramifications, to make sure any decisions you to make or legislation you'd sponsor is the right decision. I think what we look at as retailers is very few retail businesses now are exclusively within one state. So when you look at legislation here in Georgia, please consider how you do meld with the rest of the country. It's almost impossible to do retail business today and have it be contained in any geographic area. We're the world leader in innovation, and the technology we use must also mesh with the world, not just with Georgia and South Carolina or Georgia and Tennessee, or in case of Walmart, Georgia and Arkansas, but it must also mesh with Georgia and Europe and Georgia with Asia. So be careful what we do. Customers, as I said earlier, if we don't treat customers right, if they feel we're abusing their privacy, if they feel we're abusing their security, they will not shop in our member stores. They'll go to a store where they are treated well. And lastly, that little EPC code, that thing that's on RFID, does not track personal information. And right now, Chairman Setzler, the technology even to track you doesn't exist. I'm not saying it can't. I'm saying it's probably out there, on somebody's research shelf now, but it doesn't exist. And again, all this technology is too expensive to put out broadly in today's retail market. I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I've actually enjoyed it. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. If there's other questions you have before your last meeting or before session or during session, we'll try to help you.
Other questions come in?
Just to follow up that, I've been following my information correctly in some of the discussions. To alleviate the chairman's concern, there's discussion that RFID tag, if it was to go out the store, would also be used as an alarm tag, could be used as an alarm tag. Therefore, unless it's been burned off, and you can burn it off, you can destroy that chip electronically at the cash register. So if it was to leave embedded, hidden in that tie, it would theoretically set off the alarm at the door just like a regular alarm chip does now. You'd have to return and burn it off. And that is one of the safeguards that's being looked at electronically in those chips to protect people now. So that's a very good question. I know it's being looked at according to some of the retail mags that I've been reading, is a futuristic thing to protect the consumers, just like you're concerned about. So theoretically, there's no way to walk out of that store with an active RFID tag embedded in your clothing without setting off an alarm.
I think what could happen would be that particular unique ID, a 38-digit alphanumeric code, when it's scanned at the cash register and paid for, then that numeric code goes to the system and says, this one can pass through the door because this one's been cleared, but all others that have not been cleared can't go out the door. So that you're able to clear unique item by unique item, so that you don't have to disable that actual RFID.
Yeah, but you can disable and you can burn it off. So there's a lot of options there. It depends upon how it's approached.
And sometimes that's the case. I think sometimes that's not the case. It's just a matter of what the technology that retail outlet uses, and that's just a point of discussion. That if they could all be disabled, I don't think there's an issue. There may not be an issue as it is, but I think there are technological provisions for a specific item, this specific sport coat, not this sport coat, to have been checked out and get out the door without alerting. So that's
Both of you are actually right.
Yeah, it depends upon what the retailer chooses to use.
Yeah.
I do have a quick comment. Just something that Representative Hill was saying is one area we tend to not look at is we tend to look at RFID as a transmitter only. Those can be programmed. So there is the technology. It might not be what's being implemented now, but in the RFID technology, there is the capability of linking your purchase information into that chip. So I think that's where some of the concern Representative Setzer has. But Mike, I have a comment and a couple of questions. One, the slide dealing with do biometrics invade an individual's civil liberties and privacy, being no, I think might need a little more discussion there. I think that statement is like saying, does an automobile violate the law? No, not in itself, but it has the use of it can violate the law. I think the improper use of biometric information very well can and does violate civil liberties. So the fact that we have biometrics or we use them doesn't necessarily violate civil liberties, but there is the potential for the misuse of those, and that's where really my concern comes in. Even in the retail industry, and let me give you a scenario that happened to me that would illustrate where my concerns come from. Not too long ago, I decided to get a P.O. box and another phone number in my house. And I decided this was a good time to do a little test. And so I told my family, do not use this P.O. box or phone number for anything for this time period. And we went somewhere and filled out a special offer at one of the retailers, or it might have been I can't remember exactly what it was, a giveaway or something. And I said, use that P.O. box and use that phone number. And that's the only time we used it. And it wasn't much longer until I started getting special offers from everybody across the world. I mean, everybody you could think of. So I knew through reverse engineering that was the point. There is my address, my information, my name originated at this point, and there is a business in sharing or selling that information across. We know that exists. That might not be an issue, but now my concern comes with when you add a fingerprint, or you add a retina, or you add a digital photograph to the same retailers. Is there a propensity for those retailers to then share that information as they do other information? And I think that's where the concern comes in with myself and I think other committee members is there is an expected, we as consumers expect a certain level of privacy even if that information is shared to a retailer. My concern is that there isn't a protection now that says if I go into a bank and put my fingerprint down, which I personally won't bank at a bank that does that, but that's, if as far as regulating business, if a retailer wants to take a blood sample, in my opinion, that's their right, but I'm not going to shop there, okay? I think we're in agreement there. But what they do with that information and their responsibility protected, I do think is an interest of the public. And I'm not sure that we have right now the control or information to say, well, first of all, I think a lot of this can be defined by, or be resolved by defining who owns my information. If I give you my fingerprint, that's my fingerprint. If I own it, and you take that fingerprint and sell it to someone else, then have you committed an act of fraud or theft? So this is kind of where I see this fuzziness, or this dividing line is, I don't want to regulate business, but at the same time, when you do go into these areas, as Chairman Sessler has said, is I can't change my fingerprint, I can't change my DNA. These are identifiable characteristics of me that I can never get rid of. And then once that is established through who knows where, now we have an issue. So I think that's one of the areas I'd like for you to maybe address from the retail's perspective. What your thoughts in that? Are we expected just to give a blind trust to retailers, and probably 80% of them wouldn't do anything, but this 20% that can cause trouble? That's kind of the thought process I'm building here.
And I hear you very clearly. My question is, and I don't want anyone to give or sell or rent your fingerprint to anybody. But having said that, there's less risk in that than other personal information like your home address and your phone number and your name, which can be put on an application and a person can apply for credit. I don't know. I don't want to be naive. I don't want to be over. What's what I'm looking for? I don't want to be flippant, but I don't know of any legal document I work on now to obligate myself in debt to anybody that relies on a fingerprint or an iris print or a facial print or any of the biometrics. I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, maybe our grandkids will be able to buy things with a digital fingerprint. I don't see it's happening because the liveness factor in today's society is the key issue. We talked about that earlier. You're not going to go in with a piece of paper with a fingerprint. You're not going to send a fingerprint through electronic lines, through a modem and get a product. It's just not going to happen today because the liveness issue is so important to us. Now, I don't say the first speaker talked about Orwellian ideas. Is it Orwellian to think that someday, sometimes, that would be your signature through electronic lines? I hope not. I'm not going to say it could be or it can't be. It's not anywhere in the foreseeable future. It's not in the next decade. It's not in the next 5 years. We're not going to do business that way in the United States or in the world.
Well, I think there's another aspect to this too that when we were debating the fingerprint issue on driver's license that came up is, depending on how the retailer's verification goes, and we talked about some really not having a verification, but I could theoretically go to a retailer and I could have fraudulent documents that say that I am John Hevner and establish an account and give them my own fingerprint. Now I have used my fingerprint to identify, at least to that retail outlet, that I am you. Now, if that information is then shared, then I have actually, through the retailer, engaged in some sort of identity theft. And so this is, when you start looking at it from different angles, that's why my concern is not that you want to take my fingerprint to do business in your retail. I might decide to do that, but is that data then going to go somewhere else without my explicit authority or my approval to do so?
And I understand your concern, and I just don't think it's a technology or a process that's going to be happening. I mean, that's just my opinion of knowing the retail industry. It's not going to happen. Things like cell phones, things like smart card, are things that are going to happen. And if you're worried about things, that's the stuff to worry about, not your fingerprint or your iris print or your face print.
Personally, I'm not going to shop anywhere that sends me messages on my cell phone.
Well, again, it's an opt-in, opt-out thing. You don't have to.
Mr. Hevner, I've got one last question. I don't know if other members of the committee. I've asked the subpoena question to most folks. And again, this really has nothing to do with retail practice. This really has to do more with personal privacy. I think a concern of the committee, as we talked early last session before we established this resolution, was just the concept of removing in the direction of empowering government, law enforcement, outside entities, third parties from being able to track and monitor the activities of individuals. I don't think it's fantastic to say that as this process becomes common practice and goes from being somewhat of a novelty to becoming common practice, that it will become more and more embraced by the public, whether or not the public's thought through the implications of it. And I can see examples of, Mr. Smith, we've got you on track. You submitted your fingerprint to Walmart store in Bainbridge at 6:15 on this night, and even though you live in Cobb County, there was a crime committed at 7:45 that night. 2 miles away, you happen to buy a crowbar there at the Walmart, and we think you use that same crowbar, and all of a sudden we've got access. What we're doing is we're really broadcasting biometric information around that. I don't think you as a commercial entity would have any ability to say to any party, hey, we can't give this up. Hey, if you want to use this as a issue us a warrant, or issue any store within 30 miles of this location, issue us all warrants to look for information for the individual who rendered this fingerprint as they broke into this key facility, broke into a law enforcement facility, whatever. The retail industry would be in no position to say, no, we can't give that information. We're going to protect the personal privacy of our customers. I'm just concerned that we think through the implications of what it means to have millions and millions of people per day rendering this information that in fact pinpoints them at this location and this time, day in, day out, such that over time it could be a common practice that we're in a retail culture that really rests on using biometric information.
It could come. I don't see it coming in the near future. I do say that retailers would comply with a warrant.
I know you would.
Good citizens try to be.
Sure.
But having said that, they could, unless you paid cash today, we can trace your transaction by credit card anyway. So it's not that different than what we're doing today. I don't see the risk being any higher than what we are. In fact, I see the risk being lower with biometrics than I do with current technology.
Sure. Mr. Evans, I really appreciate your time and patience.
Thank you so much. Real privilege.
Absolutely. Again, we continue to be a little behind schedule as a committee. It's I've got 10 minutes till 3. I'd like to call forward one more group before we consider a short break. We've got Elizabeth Chandler from the Georgia Bankers Association. And Ms. Chandler, we've got your program for 45 minutes, but take as much time or as little time as you need.
Help if you're behind schedule. Exactly. It's time to go. I wish I did. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for having me. My name is Elizabeth Chandler, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Government Relations with the Georgia Bankers Association. The membership of the GBA is comprised of over 360 commercial banks and thrift institutions from throughout Georgia. Upon being invited to join you today, I've attempted to gather the latest information on the use of biometrics being utilized in Georgia banks today. While it appears that there's little usage at this point in time, the banking industry remains optimistic that known technologies are improving every day, and new technologies are coming on the market which there may be a need for in our industry. The issue of identity theft is paramount in our everyday thinking, and the case can be made that the use of biometrics can and will go a long way toward protecting the privacy of our customers, as well as sensitive information inside of our banks. Biometric-based solutions can provide for confidential financial transactions and personal data privacy. Network security infrastructures, secure electronic banking, investing, and other financial transactions are already benefiting from these technologies. While some banks have begun using biometrics for customer and in-house security, they do seem largely to be in a testing phase, though. However, there are several recent developments worth noting. Biometrics received increased attention from the banking industry when the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, it's a mouthful, told bankers that single-factor authentication, such as just a password, is inadequate for high-risk online transactions, and that they must perform a risk assessment by the end of this year and toughen their authentication systems. That would be for online banking. Bankers have begun testing secret questions, password-generating tokens, and biometrics to improve online security. Also, we understand that federal employees will be issued new ID cards this fall, which will require fingerprints and possibly retinal scans or other forms of biometric identification, depending on the agency. And that card will be used to gain access to federal facilities and possibly ultimately to grant access to computer applications. Our industry, as well as others, will likely borrow from these new standards for government workers. At a minimum, the widespread use of biometrics by the federal government is expected to drive down the cost of the technology, which could spur adoption in the private sector. One larger financial institution now uses one form of biometrics, fingerprint authentication, for its branch employees. Previously, branch employees had to sign on to, in some cases, more than 15 systems, and each system required a separate password that changed monthly. Some employees had so much trouble remembering that obviously they wrote those passwords down, and that obviously works against the value of the security systems. Now, those branch employees can sign into all systems by putting a fingerprint on a reader. This particular bank pilot tested the system in 2003, and it's been in place in all of their branches for over a year now. In another case here in Georgia, the use of hand geometry is used when allowing customers into the safe deposit box area of the bank. The system is a standalone system within the branch. The hand geometry scan replaces the signature verification usually done by a bank employee. The system is a so-called one-to-one recognition system whereby the user inputs a 4 to 10-digit PIN number and then places their palm on the reader where the hand templates are stored. The system then determines if a match is made using both the PIN with the hand template stored in the memory. It takes a match of both factors to allow the customer through. Other biometric technologies that we understand are being explored by banks include voice recognition and digital signatures that could possibly be used by both bank employees and customers for personal verification in order to conduct business or change their user passwords and things of that sort. They would likely be used in conjunction with a second verification factor, though. As for privacy concerns, possibly no other industry takes customer information as seriously as the banking industry. This includes any biometric data. Any bank that already employs biometric technology did not do so without exhaustive testing as to the security of the system. This exhaustive process sums up why biometrics are not used more often in the banking industry, and we would not move forward on any new system without the full faith and backing of the technology industry and, more importantly, our regulators. In conclusion, while the use of biometrics in the banking industry is in its infancy, the prospect of this convenient technology is seen as considerably more accurate than current methods, and the banking industry is committed to the protection and privacy of our customers and our internal systems. Therefore, methods that step up that level of personal protection are worth exploring in our minds. And that is a brief overview, and I'll be happy to try and answer any questions.
Members of the committee. Representative Cooper.
I'm curious about, especially as we look at transporting our medical information with us, what are the statistics on the breach of the, I mean, I don't use the automatic banker, so, because I figure I would do it at 1 o'clock in the morning after session at the wrong place in downtown Atlanta and get mugged. So it's just better that and I probably wouldn't remember my password, so I'm one of those. But how often is that system breached and somebody gets money out of somebody's account? I mean, it seems like if we can go to automatic tailors and get money out of our thing and we can use a credit card, you know, at the gas pump, that we ought to be able to make our medical information secure. So I'm curious, is there a great deal of problems with that system? Do people get that information, or do people lose money out of their accounts frequently? What's the background on that?
I don't know that I could give you any firm statistics. I can tell you that the bank security is an industry in and of itself. And it's certainly something that we work every day to stay a step in front of the criminal element on. Clearly, there is some identity fraud in our industry like all others, but something we're working on every day. So I'm sorry I don't have any hard and fast statistics for you.
Representative Loudermilk.
Really, mine's the same question I've asked most anyone who's in previous meetings and this one today is without a doubt, biometrics is here, and it is there is an element of security to protect my interest in there. So it's especially when we're talking about private business and private industry. My concern comes with not as much the use of biometrics, but the protection and the distribution of that information that once it is obtained. For instance, you mentioned the hand geometry used to protect safety deposit box. It's undoubtedly a great way to protect that safety deposit box. My concern comes is when I no longer am using that safety deposit box, is there a regulatory statute in place or a common practice in place that says once I no longer use that safety deposit box, I'm not renting it or whatever, is that data destroyed? If I no longer have an account with a bank, is my fingerprint data retained or is it destroyed? That's the really where my concern is as Representative Setzler has said, that's information you can't change. That's information, in my opinion, that you own. And I think that's really where I'm looking in this is there a standard out there federally, statewide, or within the industry for, one, protecting that biometric data that is used so it's not subject to an incident like Choice Point or something like that. And two, is there a policy or regulatory precedent there to dictate retention of that data? Because basically if you have the data, you have to protect it, and there's a responsibility. But I'm not sure as a government or a society we have established what that responsibility is, especially with the biometric data.
I think banks are unique in the area of record retention because we have hard and fast guidelines on that, and it depends on what the record is, whether it's loan data or whether it's personal identifying information. But at some point in time, if you're no longer a customer or if we no longer have a need for that data, then it's destroyed appropriately. So I think that, again, we are a little bit unique in that area. You mentioned the hand geometry data. It's a unique system in that it's not exactly a picture of your palm. It's there's several pictures taken from different angles, and then there are measurements taken. It's a system based on measurements of your hand, not like your individual fingerprint. So that's just a little difference in that technology there. And you mentioned Choice Point. The issue of data breaches are large on our radar screen, and we spend an awful lot of time talking about it. Banks have been required for some time, since the passage of the federal Graham-Leach-Bliley Act about 7 years ago, to have a system in place whereby if there is, heaven forbid, a data breach, then we have those notification requirements of our customers. And right now, it doesn't say, the FDIC guidelines don't say biometrics. It's a long definition of sensitive personal information, and I think from what I gather, we already know to count biometrics in that definition, but I think they're going to expressly put it in there.
Any other questions for the committee? Well, I tell you, in the interest of time, Ms. Chandler, I think we're going to move on. Is there anyone in the audience that has specific questions for Ms. Chandler while she's here talking? Anybody? I want to give everyone a chance to pipe in. Anyone else in the committee? Ms. Chandler, I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Is it the pleasure of the committee to take a quick break or press on? Okay, I'm going to appoint Ms. Nuremberg, our committee assistant, to be the timekeeper here. She does a better job of that than I do. I've got 3:05. Let's be back in here at 3:15 seated. Again, I'd like to welcome Mr. Jim Flowers from the Board of Regents. Initially, we had looked to reach out to representatives of the Department of Education to talk K-12, and then the Regents to talk higher ed. I did talk to Jim briefly and say we might ask some questions that would apply to K-12. There's certainly been some publicity regarding this issue in K-12 in the last 3-4 weeks that have made the papers. Again, we're not newspaper driven; we're issues driven. But that being said, there's certainly public awareness and public interest, and I would appreciate Mr. Flowers coming and being able to share both in breadth and depth on these issues. So, with that being said, Mr. Flowers, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. I think I will follow Ms. Elizabeth's example of keeping things short and to the point. There's one of the unique things about universities, while we profess to be technology-driven, research-driven, and on the cutting edge, getting our faculty and getting our bureaucracies to change is just as difficult as any other government and large corporate bureaucracy. So therefore, we're not necessarily on the cutting edge of some of these neat new things that are coming along. And that's both good news and bad news, depending on your perspective and what's happening. But it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about these issues. And I may qualify myself as not being an expert at times, but we'll certainly get you answers from those that are more expert than I, if necessary. And we look forward to cooperating with the committee. Real quickly, I've asked that a one-page and its front and back outline of what I'm going to talk about be handed out. I've been in the tech business since 1978. And it seems that the more mature I get, the less technology I like to use. If I can get right to the paper, it's good. I'm going to talk about education, research, healthcare, and then in some general terms, public policy frameworks. And that's really more a work product of what some of our researchers do than how we use the technologies in a business process. But first, we'll get right to our main core mission in education. We have over 259,000 full-time students registered. That is our best numbers as of today. Some people think we should have better technology tracking the students, so we can give you exact numbers today, but that is what we have. Typically, in terms of the bioinformation that was described in some of the materials I received from Jennifer, about the extent of the bioinformation we collect on students or what's on ID, and everyone's seen the picture, the signature, and they have a barcode on the back. And most of our institutions have gone to a one-card type system. So, in fact, I've just recently begun as a student again, and it's kind of neat to go up to a Coke machine and swipe it and get a Coke, or to go to the copy machine and swipe it. As long as I've fed my account with some money, it will let me do what I want to do without me having to run out to the change machine or what have you, which, when I was last in college, that was, you had to carry quarters everywhere, or you just couldn't do anything. So, the technology does have its advantages, but short of that, the system really doesn't know what I'm up to or what I'm doing, except for, the education record that I create for my performance in class. And that's true of all students. Of course, we all had to submit immunization records, we have healthcare records, and those are all protected under the HIPAA standards. The information we're allowed to publicly disclose on a student is limited to what we call directory information: name, phone number, perhaps an email address, and that's about it. We can't even tell parents certain things without waivers signed by the students, and that has pros and cons to it, but those are the guidelines under which we operate as the federal government tells us. In fact, as I go through my little talk, you're going to find, as I told Mr. Loudermilk earlier, we have so many regulations around us, it's like we live in a bowl of spaghetti, and I probably can't say much at all, but that is the way it is. Not only do we have HIPAA, which takes care of the health information of students, and FERPA, which is the Federal Education Rights Privacy Act, which began its life in 1974 and has been amended several times since, takes care of students' education records and a lot of the other information pertaining to students at our campus. We've even found out recently that Graham-Leach-Bliley applies to us as a financial institution if we take credit card information or have other financial records dealing with students our associations are kind of protesting that. We think that's been a stretch by the FTC, but be it as it may, we're subject to those compliances. I actually have a whole presentation on security compliance issues related information, and there are several slides of federal laws and regulations and state laws and regulations that attempt to help us protect information and access to information. So many, as a matter of fact, we can't afford to keep up with them, much less know if we're in compliance with them. But we aim for the ones that are important and hope that we're doing a good job, and that's just the nature of the beast when you have so many agencies that regulate you. In terms of security, though, yes, our campuses have video cameras, but none of them use identification technologies such as we heard about at the Super Bowls, where Tampa, I believe, was using cameras in the city and by your gait or other behavioral motions could potentially identify you. We certainly don't have those. Our cameras are more or less after the fact and hopefully preventors and saying, hey, there's a camera watching you. If you do something, then we can go back and review the tape. But it's certainly not stored in a biometric fashion where each and every individual recorded on tape then has that plugged into the record. Oh, that was Jim going from the student center to the library at 2 in the morning. What's going on? It's just impossible to do. We are required to keep track of students and whether or not they attend class due to visit regulations. And visit is an acronym for federal rules related to immigration and international students that are on our campuses after 9/11, and it turned out that several of the individuals involved in the unfortunate instances came here on student visas and never went to class. The Fed said, okay, you need to start telling us if they missed more than 2 days of class. It's maybe 5 days now, but they started off at 2. But there was also state legislation. I mean, it was a reaction at the time saying you should know who's in class, and of course all of you who've been through college know that going to class is your business. If you're not there, you're going to be failed, and that's the contractual relationship you have with the professor. But from a security point of view, law enforcement said, no, if there's an international student, you better know where they are, and if they don't show up, we need to know because of past pattern. And just for international, yes, ma'am.
Where did that start?
The rule was proposed in 2003 and became effective late 2003, early 2004. The big deal there has been struggling with the computer systems. We have to literally walk the data from one system to the next instead of having an automatic interface. But those things are supposedly being worked on. But be that as it may, professors are obliged to inform everyone in class that should you miss X number of classes, they must report your absences to the dean, who then takes appropriate action depending on whether or not you're an international registered student or not. So, the other activities that we could see where technology is leading us to use some biometrics would be in distance education. And of course, a number of different pressures are on us to expand access to education. Certainly, limitations on capital budgets force us to be creative or to be very efficient in using our building space for classes, and some of those solutions are to either go to hybrid schedules where we say half the time you're online, half the time you're in class, which doubles our class space right there, or to say it's all online. But then you have a question, do we have the dog taking the test or is Jim taking the test? You don't know, other than the login ID and other information we may collect at the time. Certainly a means of biometric identification would give one a deeper level of assurance that you are who you are if you're taking an exam online, for example. But those things have not come to fruition yet. I have a feeling we'll see the more commercial enterprises such as University of Phoenix come out with that technology long before, say, a public university would. We do have other uses of video in sports and football, and I can tell you they database every move of every player, and they do trend analysis and behavioral analysis. And I actually had a roommate 20 years ago who was writing software for Auburn to do just that kind of analysis based on the films then. So an unintended consequence, perhaps, of restricting what data we collect on video could be affecting the football team. I say that in jest, but research is another area we have a lot of business in. And technology in general, I can't point to any whiz-bang nanotechnology or whatever. We should all go cower under the bed, or I should write Michael Crichton to give him an idea for his next bestseller. But nonetheless, we are in those areas. And of course, that is driven by both federal demands, market demands in general, businesses, and science. Can't predict which way that's going to go. We just don't know of anything on the shelf or boiling in the back beakers that would cause a lot of concern at this point. We do research in a lot of federal departments. They do impose security requirements way beyond anything we would require normally of our employees and our students, and we do have some students that work in those labs. We don't have any control on that. The security systems they place, which do use biometrics, are monitored by the federal agencies and the security agencies, and they audit the compliance with the equipment, the use of the equipment, and in short, it's not our business. We just have to use it. And I really don't have lots of details going on there. I know there's some things at Tech in that realm. I know there's some things at Georgia and some of the biology research. But those are all DOD or DHS or other appropriate federal agency safeguards and security measures.
Mr. Flowers, could you speak to what those things are? Do you have any sense of that?
Some of them are as simple as a finger scan. There's retina scans. Of course, there's a lot of background checking going on before you get the card that allows you to even get to the point of getting the second or tertiary check on your identity. And then you're in a black box. And I have no idea what goes on in there. That's part of the rules.
Okay. And these are generally technologies that are defense-related?
They're defense-related. They're what you see in the Pentagon or any top secret or higher classification facility. So, I mean...
Okay.
Like I said, that's what they require us to do in return for doing the research.
Okay, gotcha.
Healthcare, of course, the Medical College of Georgia not only is affiliated with this hospital and provides healthcare, also does research. And I put them down here as an example. Any of our institutions that does research that involves a human subject. And on the one extreme, that's as simple as a survey. A social science survey must go pass under the checkoffs of an institutional review board, which is a committee that says, are you going to harm any of the subjects? What guidelines do you have in place, et cetera, and so forth. And how are you protecting the data, and what kind of data, and those kinds of questions. There is actually a standard for behavior and process of these boards that is nationally and even internationally recognized. And so whether it's medical research, which has the nth degree of checkoffs, or something simple as social science research, which probably is, I don't think would be anywhere near as severe as what you would do in terms of making sure that medical research is not harming someone. Those reviews, and it is more or less an independent assessment. They can halt the research or prevent it from ever taking place if they feel there aren't sufficient safeguards in place, or if they feel it could harm the subjects that are involved in the research. And so that I just bring that up to the committee's knowledge as far as how we have checkoffs in place in such research. Now, the policy frameworks, and I and Chairman talked a couple of weeks ago about trying to see if we had sufficient policy experts, people that study public policy for a living, and actually that's what I'm trying to get my certificate to do. And I spoke to several at Tech and at University of Georgia and at Georgia State, and they all had a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle this committee is addressing. One of the suggestions I had that was most constructive said, look, we'd be more than willing to sit one-on-one or many-to-one, whatever you like, but in a setting where it's really an informal 2 to 3 hour discussion of the various aspects of this problem. And I just put a few down here on the handout. Everyone agreed this is a very challenging and interesting idea, and it does touch everyone's lives. But there are a lot of different perspectives to consider. It cuts across a lot of interest groups, as I know you've heard in your testimony, a lot of jurisdictions, and there are a lot of perspectives. What you're doing could affect commerce, could affect research, both positively and negatively. I don't mean to be judgmental about what I'm saying here. Could affect our position and competitiveness, either as a state, a locality, or a nation. And it could be, I wouldn't say it's mundane, but it could be as straightforward as customer service. And as you know, the governor is pushing faster, friendlier, and easier as a motto for state customer service. And just like Amazon and some of the other e-retailers that collect information of what you like to do, how you like to do it, so they can be more responsive to your needs, we can see where that would be something that not only education but other agencies and government will want to use in order to be more responsive to the public. So we just have to kind of look across it at both the good and the bad of technology, so we try to come up with policies that deal with that. And as I said, these individuals would be more than happy at a date convenient to the committee to meet and discuss. But none of them felt they could do it justice in 10 or 15 minutes, and so they deferred at this time. So with that said, that was all I had to say formally. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to address them or to find you the appropriate answers.
Again, thank you very much for your presentation. And again, I'd like to turn over to members of the committee. Again, without a representative from K-12 education, I certainly contemplated being able to discuss educational environments broadly, equating some basic needs in a regent's environment being very similar to other educational environments. Are there any questions to that point that we could address to Mr. Flowers while we've got him?
I do have one question about the presentation. FERPA, does that apply to private institutions as well, or
yes, it does.
Any post-secondary?
Yeah, I believe the hook is anybody that receives federal funds, but student loans or whatever, so that pretty much touches everyone by default. So that's K through 12, and it's technical colleges, community colleges, universities, profit and not-for-profit. Now, I think there are some cases of extreme proprietary institutions like the LA Music School for Grunge Rock, which my son is interested in. We may need to talk about that for legislation, but nonetheless, they might escape if they don't accept any federal funds whatsoever, but they would be an extreme minority.
Now, is the FERPA simply for, does that deal with K through 12 at all? Or
Educational.
Yeah, it deals with all the educational records. In fact, as the accountability movement is progressing, and Secretary Spellings of the United States Department of Education had a press conference for her action plan on higher ed accountability, and we're talking about a K through 16 or above record that follows the student. And that has certainly been a goal within the reform efforts in this state, I know, is understanding, okay, as a student moves through K-12 and then goes through secondary and post-secondary education, how can we see what the product of the various systems are and if they're succeeding or failing, et cetera. And I know there are some efforts on behalf of all the education agencies in this state to help with that transfer of information so we can go up and down the river of information to see which programs affect what, how, and which we should disband and which we should improve, and et cetera. And certainly it's part of a national movement in looking at standardizing not only the records but how we measure our successes in higher ed, which higher ed tends to be a little loosey-goosey around what's good and what's bad in terms of education. Of course, there are thousands of years of tradition there, and that comes into opposition sometimes with change. But those movements require some standard level of access to information about each and every student, no matter where they're going or attending school. And so those records fall under the federal jurisdiction, and that's what FERPA is all about.
Now, I don't know if that applies to, and before I walked in, I know that you were touching on the issue with one of the school districts in Georgia has broken into a new arena of taking fingerprints from children before they get their school lunch. And I believe the issue from talking with others is not as much in I have an issue with I don't know why we'd need to do it in an elementary and school setting, but is that this was done without notification or consent of the parents, and the children were not given the option to opt out. I know you might not have any information on this, but if you had any, does FERPA deal with any of this? I mean, because we're talking, I guess, two realms. You're with the Board of Regents, which most of those students are in adulthood and they're going to answer for themselves. But when we're talking K through 12, you're usually dealing with a minor who is the responsibility of a parent and doesn't have the capability to make those wise decisions. Of course, I've got a teenager too, and I'm wondering if sometimes, even though just they've reached the 18, if they can still make those wise decisions. But if you have any background or information.
Well, I saw the same video report you may have seen of the school. I think it was in Rome that was using it. And I think their justification is, hey, it's quicker and more efficient than the old way, and I can understand that. Now, as a parent, and that's the viewpoint I'm going to give you now, is as a parent, I would appreciate the notification, and probably with a reasonable explanation, I'll go, okay, fine, maybe not, but you know, they use a fingerprint scan on your index finger to check off that you got a lunch that day.
Oh, and you pay for it in monthly or something?
Yeah, so it's just checking. Says, oh, Jim got a lunch today. Knock, you know, it's $2 or something now, isn't it? Off your account and so forth. I know University of Georgia, we use a hand scan in concert with an ID card for access to the cafeterias into the Tate Recreation Center. I dug into that, and it turns out they've been doing that since 1972. And technology has improved over time, but and the information on the hand scan, it starts off two-dimensional. It's a little more complicated today, but it's unique to that system, so it can't be used anywhere else, and it just ties you to that card. So it says, oh, that's Jim with his card. Jim didn't loan his card to somebody. And so, you know, the folks that run those facilities are trying to be accountable and responsible and make sure that facilities are used by those that paid for the facilities. But as I checked, you know, I was shocked and surprised. It went all the way back to 72. I didn't go to Georgia, but I thought my friends would have told me about it, but so be it. But in question of the FERPA information, they're very, very strict about releasing any information other than basic, you know, name and yes, they're here. As a minor, I think that may be even more restrictive, but I would have to go to someone else that's more. FERPA is really thick, and when they issue a rule as simple as whether they'll accept a digital signature, it takes 6 pages of fine print. Now, the good news is they gave rule-making ability to the Department of Education, so there's flexibility. They can deal with the year-to-year adjustments as new technologies or events occur, and you don't have to go back through the legislative process, which we all know can sometimes be quick, sometimes not. But I believe in school of management. You hire responsible people, give them the guidelines to operate. If they misoperate, you fire them. If not, you allow them to do the business, and you can be more effective.
Thanks.
Mr. Flowers, question I have centers around establishing a clear need. I think, you know, we talked about before, most every entity that's going to collect biometric information is going to do what they believe is adequate in terms of safeguarding and protecting it. I mean, I'm assuming some level of good faith. And most of the ones that have come and talked to us today have demonstrated a compelling need for one reason or another for collecting what they collect, whether it's medical information that looks at DNA or other things for looking at medical or potential medical conditions, the obvious security needs associated with financial security, security issues tied to retail transactions where they want to, you know, there's theft issues, there's identity issues with credit and so forth. But again, you have to look at making the compelling case for each potential disclosure of info, and you know, in essence, it's not anyone's opinion. It's a fact that, you know, this information represents a Fourth Amendment search. And you'd think there'd need to be some reason to compel someone to do it. And you look at retail. I'm just kind of prefacing a question I'm going to ask you just by reference of context. I mean, you look at a retail outlet. If one retail outlet requires to use a credit card, you submit a fingerprint. You can make the decision in the marketplace, I'm not going to choose to patronize that outlet. I'm going to go to this outlet and shop in this store. In the context of banking, you could make that same decision in the marketplace. But in the context of schools, be it K-12, be it the regents, unless we're going to take the position that if kids don't like it, they can leave the state and go to New Hampshire and get a college education, there's questions of really access to basic things that we consider to be fairly fundamental, which is access to an education. So with that as a preface, are we not treading on different ground in the context of education, where if students were required to give up information as a means of being in the student body of a public school, a public higher ed institution, aren't we now treading on different ground where if you want to go to college in Georgia and get a public education, then you've got to give up, you have to submit to a Fourth Amendment church. You don't have the ability to go and say, you know what, I'm not going to choose to go to Walmart. I'm going to go to Target because I like the way Target treats me versus the way, you know, and it's, or Walmart versus Target for purposes of the cameras. So I asked that question, do you see any compelling reason from a higher education standpoint, from a security context, that would be compelling to say every student ought to be required to give up biometric information?
Well, first I would ask for a very strict definition of biometrics to give you an answer. But if we're talking abstractly and in terms of, some philosophy there.
Handprint, fingerprint, you name it. Iris scan.
One could say it's part of a contractual relationship. If you want this service, this is what I require. If you don't want to give it to me, that's fine. You just can't have the service, and be that as it may. We have no such requirement other than proving to us that you are Jim, that you do belong to your educational record, and that you do belong to your SAT score and any other data you've submitted for us to accept you, and that your money is good. As far as admittance into a public school or of higher education, yes, we do have some business services at UGA that require the hand scan, and we do have employment requirements where defense and other security needs may require more. Those are all conditions of participation that you may elect not to participate in, and that is just choices we have to make as we go through life. It's just part of it. As far as requiring things that may deny access, I don't foresee a need from the education community's point of view where that would be the case unless some security requirement that we can envision right now, we all know the world changes very rapidly now, comes down on us, and that would probably come from the federal government more than likely than the state government, that says we have to understand each and every student, where they are, that they are who they are, and can report that. And I can assure you that the community, the education community, especially in higher ed, is just rebellious enough and independent enough to, they would probably stage a revolt over that stricter requirement. But again, we all are servants of the state and of the public, and we do what we're told to do, or we choose employment elsewhere. But I'm not trying to evade your question. I just don't see the need coming up administratively where we'd have to do that unless someone compels us to place that need.
You got to ask the question because, again, I think we can make the case within Georgia. We're K-12 education. I mean, you can certainly go to a private school and make those kinds of choices, but within the framework of public education and public universities, I would certainly. I think it's a policy discussion. Should you have to submit certain information to get an education in Georgia? And maybe it's okay. Maybe you're a conspiracy theorist, though, and think, I don't think the state of Georgia can protect anything. I don't trust them with that, and I'm not in a position to make a market choice to go there versus there. And I think that's a policy discussion we can have.
It certainly is, and we'd be glad to help along those lines. We wrestle with those issues both theoretically and practically every day. So,
one follow-up to that, if I could, it's related. I was thinking about kids in a school lunch line with parents being uninformed. Are there things you make within the university system that you make a distinction between adults and unemancipated minors? I mean, is that a distinction to make there? Because certainly in an elementary school setting, these are not, quote, adults. The parents are the ones who are legally responsible to make those decisions. And can a child submit to divulge their information, and is that an appropriate decision for a child to make, or is that something that would be more rightly in the hands and of the responsibility of parents?
There is a gray area for those that are under 18 that attend school at our campuses. I'm not an attorney. I can't get into the details. Of course, the doctrine of in locus parentis has undergone some modification where the college effectively became your parent and would deal with the police if you had an infraction or things like that. I don't think those days are here anymore. But nonetheless, there's assumed that the administration can act on a minor's behalf in certain instances, and then, of course, in contact with the parents. I think institution by institution, they may have particular things they work out, and I would have to go survey and get you the right answer on that. I'm just giving you a very general view. That's a very small portion of our student population, but most of those individuals that are there, they're either within a few months of being 18 or they're extremely bright and capable kids. And we have had some get through by 16 and be on their way to a PhD, so that happens very rarely. Now, you were talking about earlier about some of the information required. Probably the most intrusive that occurs now is the identity you must hand over to the test givers, the education testing board out of Princeton that does the SATs and the ACTs, and certainly when I took the GREs last year, I had to give up a thumbprint and a photo, so they say, yep, that was Jim walking behind the door, and he got locked in there for 4 hours. I took the test on computer and walked out. The nice thing was it was scored. I didn't have to wait 6 weeks, but yeah, it was convenient. At least no anxiety there. But, that was because of a reaction to some test fraud that's occurred both at the SAT and the graduate and LSAT and all the other standardized tests that are sold and given for access to education. And that's a private testing concern, not for profit, but private. And that was their reaction in response to lawmakers, both federal and state, saying, hey guys, you got to tighten this up because we hand out scholarship money, loan money, et cetera, and there's got to be accountability. And so it's not our requirement, it was their requirement. Certainly we need access to the test scores to qualify a student, but it's a third-party arrangement.
Any other questions of the committee? Hearing none, any questions from the audience? Mr. Flowers while he's here.
I don't have Georgia, Tennessee tickets, so.
This weekend?
Not this weekend either. Those things are tough. I think tech tickets are getting tough, too.
Yes.
Mr. Flowers, appreciate your time very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate sharing with us. I think we're down to our last speaker, Mr. Kim Kimbrough from the County Commissioners Association. This man is known for his brevity in this building, and we trust he'll live up to that reputation.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for placing me last on the agenda, because that puts me in a position to help you out, send you home with a smile on your faces. I'm here today, of course, I'm Kim Kimbrough from the County Commissioners Association. I'm assistant counsel there, and I'm here to speak to you guys about local governments and our role as public employers, which puts us in a different framework when we're speaking about the Fourth Amendment and constitutional protections as a government actor, because we're in our non-prosecutorial capacity. When we're collecting data from folks at this point, we are not seeking it for prosecution purposes, and the Supreme Court has held that what we're doing there is has to be a balance between a compelling governmental interest versus that person's individual rights, and that's a case-by-case, fact-specific balancing that has to be made. And so there are certain things that we're allowed to get and certain things that we're not allowed to get, and I'll just throw out there, even though it's not a biometric directly on point issue, but random drug screens. And random drug screens blanket for all public employees? No, bad thing. But people who either operate machinery, are vested with weapons, vested with custody and control over persons who are vulnerable, and that's not just jail inmates, but folks who are working in our healthcare settings. Those folks, sure, the Supreme Court in case after case has said, well, you have a compelling interest there to protect the citizens and in these services you provide, and so your governmental interest is compelling and overrides that person's individual rights. And so I see that in future cases where biometric data gathering is going to be challenged for public employers, probably that same sort of analysis is going to occur. So it's going to be incumbent upon governmental actors to find some compelling need to collect that data. I think the other issue that we've got hanging out there from a legal perspective is the Open Records Act here in Georgia, and of course the Freedom of Information Act federally. Things that might not otherwise be a problem for private businesses to collect in terms of information, and they can protect that information short of discovery in a civil proceeding. Anybody can request any records or data that's held by a government, and short of the few protections that we have enacted, name, social security number, maiden name, and address now of all public employees, short of that, and of course we would have to go back and specifically address any biometric data because they are not contained within our current definitions of protected information. Anybody can get that information under open records, and so there's no protection for that whatsoever.
I'm hearing you say that there's no protection from open records for data beyond those specific items you've listed within public employees. So if there were biometric information collected, or even drug test information collected, that would...
Well, drug test information would be protected under the medical protection.
Okay.
You've got both state law and federal law protections on that, HIPAA, and then we also have state law protections on drug tests and confidentiality of those tests. But because we go through, and first of all, the Open Records Act has to be construed broadly and any exceptions construed narrowly, and that is because of the spirit of the Sunshine Law, that everything that is done by the government is on behalf of the public. The public has the right to that information. Once again, exemptions are narrowly construed. So if you say name, address, phone number, that's it. You can't say, well, you know, your fingerprint is part of who you are, and that's part of your name. And no, it doesn't work that way. Name, address, phone number. So if biometric information is intended to be protected, that's going to have to be specifically addressed in the Open Records Act.
So a following question to that is, let's say a sheriff's deputy. By this, what you're explaining is that his name or address and some personal information about him can be protected from open records.
That's correct.
But not any of this biometric information.
That's correct. And I'll give you, for instance, this is kind of, we have not yet seen this, but it's kind of one of my nightmare scenarios representing public employers, specifically as it relates to police officers and other people who are accessing sensitive areas. If you're using an RFID card to gain access and protect access, I'm waiting for somebody to say, I would like to have the access records for Deputy Kimbrough on the days that he entered the jail and left the jail. I don't believe that would be protected under our security plans. I don't think that would be protected under our Homeland Security, because we're not divulging a security measure at the jail. We're not divulging the location of the jail or any of the other things that we might consider sensitive about the jail. We just want to know when was Deputy Kimbrough in and out of the jail. And actually, and for a defense attorney's purpose, and of course defense attorneys do heavily use the Open Records Act, that might be considered material to something he's trying to prove about when I entered and left the jail. But because I have an RFID card hanging off my collar, he should be able to get that, because there's a database that keeps track of every time I came in. K. Kimbrough, 6:45, this date. So, and that's not protected. And the Open Records Act, I mean, I think sometimes, maybe that governmental bias. I mean, one of the things about the Open Records Act is that even though it's intended to shed sunshine on what we provide for our citizens, what we hold in trust for our citizens, anybody can use the Open Records Act. You don't have to be a citizen of the state of Georgia, a taxpayer in the state of Georgia, in order to avail yourself of the Open Records Act. You can be somebody from Texas. You could be somebody from Puerto Rico. You could be somebody from anywhere, anytime, and avail yourself of those Open Records Act protections. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. That's for the General Assembly, for your sense and wisdom.
Mr. Kimbrough, I'll let you keep going. I do have a question I wanted to which you may address later. You were talking about no blanket drug screens for public employees. You've got to make a case as to why the performance of their duties would specifically require that. How does that apply to private employment? Is that specifically public employment you're talking about? Or do companies as a policy and a right-to-work state still say, companies do it all the time, as I understand?
Sure. And the public employer, once again, because of our governmental nature,
okay,
we are bound by the Constitution. Whereas the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, only acts against governmental actors. Doesn't act against private corporations. You can't make a constitutional claim against a private actor, because private actor is an individual. All rights not specifically enumerated for the government are reserved to the individual. So the Constitution is there to restrain government. So you don't make constitutional claims against private actors. You make individual claims. You make an invasion of privacy claim. And of course you have a separate legally defined theory of what your rights to privacy are. And they are personal to you, and they are not necessarily protected by the Constitution per se.
Clearly, I'm not a labor lawyer. So as you go through this, I'm going to ask a couple questions about how it might apply to private employment. But again, I'll let you get back on.
Well, and that's an excellent segue, because one of the interesting kind of crisis points that I see governments approaching is that there is ever more pressure for governments to operate like businesses. And of course, as we're trying to achieve the efficiency of private businesses, we would like to avail ourselves of technology such as what we've heard some of the representations here today. I mean, we'd like to be able to verify eligibility using technology. We'd like to verify that our services are being delivered in an appropriate and timely fashion to the folks who pay for it. We'd like to be able to track our resources and manage our resources. We want to know where our trucks are in the field. We want to know if our employees are showing up on time. We want to know how much time they're spending at work, off work, on leave, sick, healthy. We'd like to try to help our employees stay healthy to reduce our health care costs. All those things are things that in the private sector, private business can do that at the snap of a finger, and there's not much concern other than in the marketplace and marketplace forces for what they're doing with that data, how they're collecting it and maintaining it, managing it, and using it. However, the public employer, as the government, we stand in different shoes. And frankly, I think that's part of what's holding us back, because we don't want to address those issues. When we start to collect biometric data for perhaps verification of eligibility for services, what do we do with that data? I mean, it's now going to be potentially unprotected from Open Records Act, and we're going to be strictly liable for any misuse, for any breach, for any abuse that comes out from that. And so, oddly enough, I think a lot of government employers are just staying away from it because it's risk averse. And certainly as an attorney, I would counsel my clients, you might not want to go there. If what you have now is working, let's not venture into that territory until we can see some additional protections, and we can figure out how to do this without breaking the bank. Another interesting crossover there as well is privatization. One of the wonderful things that we do have is we have the contractual ability to contract out for services, garbage collection, health care, water and sewer, any number of privatized services. We can privatize an entire city now. However, the Open Records Act applies to private actors acting on behalf of governments. So just because they're private actors doesn't mean that they evade that review. If that were the case, I think if you could evade the Open Records Act by privatizing, you have a lot more privatized governments. But so certainly, once again, that's a pushback. And if the private businesses are availing themselves of this technology, once again, now we've opened up those records and that data to disclosure, because we're governments and we're different, and there's different expectation, different legal standard that we're held to. Finally, as it relates to security, I think we have pretty much covered the protections for security, and that's probably the third biggest area behind resource management and verification of eligibility. That's the third biggest area where you'll see government employers using biometrics and RFID technology in their day-to-day operations. There are sensitive facilities that must be secured. There are sensitive pieces of equipment that we have to track and maintain. And so you will see a heightened use there. But we still have not yet gotten to the point where you'll see the super secret facilities where we're doing retinal scans and fingerprint scans and that sort of thing. However, what's coming is that in addition to, and y'all have already covered the Real ID Act for just the driver's license and citizenship source of information, but we also have under the Homeland Security rules now, under the National Response Plan and National Incident Management System, we're going to go through here shortly within the next 2 years a period of credentialing, whereby all Homeland Security responders are going to have a standardized type of credential that identifies them by the type of responder they are, who they work for, and certainly, just as we've talked about federal employees, they're going to be instituting a very serious use of biometric data to verify their identity. That same sort of philosophy is going to cross over into credentialing. Now, what does that mean for governments, particularly local governments? Homeland Security is no longer just fire, police, and law enforcement. It's now public health, public works, water and sewer infrastructure, because those are the things that we're going to have to respond and recover in the aftermath of a disaster, man-made or natural. Those folks are going to have to be credentialed, and that's going to be the majority of our governmental workforces. So the person who, you know, on a day-to-day basis is just out digging ditches, still going to have that federally mandated ID hanging around his or her neck with the fingerprint and whatever else the federal government requires, because in time of disaster, they're going to have that credential in order for us to have them respond to their neighbors, either here or in another state, in order to respond to an emergency. And just as in the Real ID Act, we're going to bear the burden of not only equipping them with that credential, but then we're going to have to store and maintain that. And we only hope that there will be federal law protections, as we've seen in some other areas, that will say this data must be protected. And of course, under the Open Records Act, there is a specific provision that says that any information that is protected by federal law is protected herein also. So those are our concerns and those are our uses.
Wow. This, I think we're really getting down to the heart of some of the issues we've talked about here. Before I ask a question, we'll make comment. It was refreshing to hear someone, especially in your position, to make the statement that the Constitution exists to restrict government. And I often wonder how many actually understand that we deal with in this area. In fact, last year I was often frustrated and made this statement when we were dealing with the eminent domain. The term the government's right to eminent domain was used, and in my opinion, I think our founding fathers' opinion, that government doesn't have rights, only the citizens have rights. The government has authority, of which the Constitution checks. But I did want to say I was refreshing, and actually your whole testimony is restoring some faith to me, and that we do have some folks that are looking out for the interest of not just government but our citizens in positions such as yours. My concern goes back to the open records, which I am an open government advocate, but at the same time, sometimes government can be so open that your military plans or your strategic intelligence assessment makes the front page of the paper, which I think there are compelling instances that we do keep certain information secret, especially when it deals with our military plans and our security. When you mentioned the lack of biometric protection under the Open Records Act, the scenario I'm thinking is instead of picking on the sheriff's department here, or it could be sheriffs, but now with the vulnerability we have with our water system, local government could determine we need to do a background check and fingerprint a new employee that we're bringing in to work in the water treatment plant. Is what you're saying is, as a resident of Massachusetts, I could ask for Bartow County to provide me the fingerprint card of all the employees in the water department?
To the extent that those fingerprint cards are maintained by the water department and not sent off somewhere else. If they are sitting around in a box in Bartow County Water Department, then I have 3 days to let you know when and where you can come and inspect those documents, or else we can arrange something else for your copying.
Thank you, I think. I appreciate you answering that question. Sure. But it seems like at some point we have, in our open records quest, there's a crossroads here to where our open records have gone to the point to violate someone's right to security and privacy, i.e. mine. I'm thinking, I can't remember what it was I did recently, but I think it was renting a boat or something I did with my family. I gave part of the agreement was, I think it was my car keys or my driver's license that I had to give to the attendant there, and they held that while I rented the boat, and that was their security that, you know, when I returned the boat in good condition, I would get my property back. I entered into that contractual agreement willingly with a reasonable expectation that they would protect my property while they held it, and when I completed my end of the contractual obligation, returned the equipment in good condition, then I got my property back. Mm-hmm. I think there's a reasonable expectation that they are going to protect that. I think the employee has a reasonable expectation that the government will also protect their information while it is being on loan or whatever. And it seems like maybe we have a situation here to where our our Open Records Act has failed to protect the individual's right to privacy as well. Is my assumption correct?
I would say you're pretty much on point. Now, I will add for clarity, there is one minor provision of the Open Records Act that says, to the extent that a person has an individual claim for an invasion of privacy under the Open Records Act, then it is incumbent upon that individual to assert that claim. The government can assert that claim on their behalf. And so in situations where we have faced a challenging open records request that we do believe implicates an employee's personal right to privacy, what most county attorneys would do is contact that employee, explain to them the rights that they have available, and put them on notice. And then it is, unfortunately, incumbent upon that employee to assert that right personally. And now, I've heard from the other side of this issue that, you understand that when you assume public employment, it's different than private employment. You are a servant of the people. You're a civil servant, and we have the right to know things about you that we might not otherwise have the right to know about somebody who works for Bank of America or Wachovia. One of the things that for me personally, and it took some adjustment, but I've worked for the government for a long time, so I'm well adjusted at this point. But things like knowing my salary. Knowing everything about every kind of personnel infraction I've had, not knowing whether or not I've fraudulently misused funds, but how many times I've been late for work, knowing whether or not any number of things that can be contained in a personnel file, beyond those essential things that you would think you see in anybody's personnel record. And once again, if someone requests my personnel file, short of the specifically excluded information, I have to assert my personal rights to protect any of that. And certainly, I may be successful in doing that, but I'm going to have to bear the burden to do it, and it's because I'm a public employee. And once again, there are those who believe that you chose to work for the government. And that brings with it a responsibility that we get to know everything about you. And once again, that's a policy decision that's been made at some point in time and rests with this body.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of the committee? I've got a question or two for Mr. Kimbrough. Brooks, Jim Cooper. I am particularly attuned to government employment. Particularly, certain privacy measures regarding conditions of employment. I ask questions, moving forward, and this deals on the private employment side, and again, in the context of a right to work state and private industry, would it be inappropriate for a corporation to require one of their corporate officers, if you're going to be a corporate officer in this company, I'm going to put a chip in you because you've got information, you've got a signature block for this company. I want to make sure I can watch where you're going. I've got this little computer program that we're going to make sure we know where you are at all times because, by gosh, you're an officer of this company and millions of dollars are in your hands, and we want to make sure you're not engaged in high-risk behavior. I've got questions, is that appropriate even in the context of a right-to-work state and private commerce? So I ask that as a preface to saying, in a government context, would it be within a chief of police's or a law enforcement agency's purview to say, you know what, we're going to put chips inside of all of our officers. Sometimes they're under deep cover, having a little tracking device in his wallet may not be good enough. By George, we think it makes sense. Again, some might giggle at that as, that's fantastic. That's not going to happen. But really, as we look at this holistically for government employment, and government employment does tend to have those high-risk, special kinds of jobs that don't tend to exist in the private sector, like law enforcement, certain roles. Are there any limitations to that today, or would the legislature need to enumerate what is allowable, what's not allowable in the context of, certain conditions on public employment? If you're going to be in my agency, by George, we're going to track you because you're a agent of the public trust.
I think that probably in both scenarios that you presented, the employer would lose, and for different reasons. I think that in the private setting, I mean, because there's not really any balancing to be done there. That would be a claim on that person's personal right to privacy, and I think that because of the way our government is set up and the way our laws are established, that personal right of privacy pretty much trumps anything that the business place could bring forward. There's not a legitimate business interest that I think could trump a personal privacy right in that context.
And I'm not arguing with you. I just I do respect your opinion in labor law more than certainly anyone else that we've spoken to today. I mean, I really think you've got a grasp of a lot of this. And you know, where is the dividing line? You know, to join my the company I work for full time, you do have to submit to a drug screen. You don't have to submit to recurring drug screens, but as an entry requirement to join the company, you have to do that. If I were a project manager for the state of Georgia, I wouldn't have to, but for MacTech you do. So there is a sense of which it's established through case law or statute somewhere that that's okay. Mm-hmm. But I'm hearing you say for MacTech, say, Ed, you know, you're an officer of the company now. As soon as you make VP, we're going to put this. You know, that sounds fantastic. You're saying that's crossed some line. Where is that line, and what's that based on?
I think that probably the additional protection you would have there, in addition to your personal right to privacy, is, and I'm trying to figure out. Of course, you would have to assert this claim in a certain way, but I think that you could certainly make claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, because that conduct is measured and is adjudicated by what sort of. Does this shock the conscience? Okay, and that's a phrase, but it carries significant meaning in the case law. And shocking the conscience, I think that you know, while 50 years from now, 100 years from now, it may not shock the conscience to have a chip implanted in you. I think right now we're still there, where that idea is so ridiculous on its face that it bears no merit within the marketplace of ideas. There's no reasonable person seated on a jury who would not find that offensive. And for those same reasons now, I mean, once again, recognizing that the private sector is more free to engage in this sort of conduct than a governmental employer, absent a compelling governmental interest to do so, I don't believe that there is any way that the government could force an employee to have a chip implanted in his or her neck. And certainly, I mean, here at the local level, and I would dare say even to the state level, we don't have anything that is so vital and secure. And I mean, we don't have nuclear weapons in the state defense arsenal. We don't have nerve agents in the state defense arsenal. And that's the kind of compelling governmental interest that I think that you'd have to have before a reasonable person would not have that pushback, would not see that the government does not have a need to know that sort of detailed information about you. Background check, yes. 2 or 3 different security measures to allow you access to the facility, yes. But to know where you are at all points in time by means of a device invasively planted in your body, we're at a level where I don't think I can find 12 people in the United States to sit on a jury and say, well, that's fine. And that's just, you know, that's assuming I could even get it to a jury. I'm not so sure that I could find a judge in the United States who would not throw that out on summary judgment and say this is just absolutely ridiculous.
So where do you sense in public employment and we draw the line from? I mean, is there any way we can put a box around? I mean, if we need to look at what's appropriate, what's not appropriate for public employment, I don't know that we have to do this, but I'm just I want to, again, the vision of this committee was to be out ahead of common practice, to make sure if there's things we need to put boxes around in the law so that as folks get used to being scanned and chipped and things through commercial transactions, that 20 years from now we don't find ourselves in a weird place. I just want to, again, not to drag this on, but maybe it's a discussion we need to have offline, but I think it's within the purview of this committee to say what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and make sure that that's sectioned off so we don't drift there and get there.
Sure. I would dare say that I think we have appropriate protections in place for what is appropriate and not appropriate in terms of the practice itself. I think that our one biggest threat is how we maintain and secure records in the public employment setting, where we have different standards about what we have to give up to anybody who requests the information. I really do see that as the primary threat area, because even as we look towards, once again, governments attempting to act like businesses, attempting to avail ourselves of what are recognized accepted business practices, we bear liability there. That data may fall into the wrong hands, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's no claim that we can assert, and there's no standing that we have to segregate that material as it stands now. I believe that it's probably a relatively simple fix. Of course, once we define what biometrics are, I think it's a relatively simple fix. But that's our one outstanding threat area, is that we would like to be able to protect that information, and we'd like to be able to use it and be more efficient, but we've got to find that balance. We've got to protect that information when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I've got one more question that came up out of what you were just talking about, or what we were having a discussion about the school district and taking the fingerprint. Is there an intersection between open records and FERPA here, or is FERPA going to protect the public school students' records or biometric data, or do we have the same issue there?
Well, FERPA falls within that catch-all that there's a provision in the Open Records Act that says that any information that has to be protected by a federal law is also protected herein. So FERPA certainly applies in that area. The one question that I would have there, and it's merely a question, I'm not familiar with FERPA other than general familiarity, is I would hope that the definitions of record information is comprehensive enough to incorporate biometrics, because if it is not, and that's the challenge in the law, is that as technology advances, we define terms and we define things that we want to protect or we want to govern, and then technology comes around and evades our definitions. And we see that in telecom law right now as well. I mean, we have all sorts of laws about exchange access facilities, and nobody knows where VoIP fits in exchange access facility. And that's just a real world example of how technology evades our definitions. So I would hope that FERPA has definitions of the records that are kept that incorporates biometrics, because otherwise that is something that would need to either be addressed federally or here in state law.
Jim, since you know FERPA front and back, do you know?
Well, of course, federal law trumps state law in this matter, but FERPA explicitly tells us what we can, so there's no gray area there. So if we're required to collect biometric for the reason it's not included in the list of things we may disclose. So it's kind of the very explicit what we may disclose versus accepting what we
Okay.
FERPA says 2%.
Okay.
Mr. Kimber, I do have hopefully one last question. Access to public places. There's some precedents of access to public places where folks are being asked to give fingerprints before they enter a publicly accessible place. You could view that in the context of courthouses, public buildings, or even publicly accessible privately owned space, which would be, protected, that not a private club, but something that's publicly accessible, like a sports arena or something. Do you anticipate the county commissioners, and I know you can't speak for your association formally, do you anticipate resistance or concern from local governments if the General Assembly considered involving themselves, writing a statute specifying what kind of information can be collected as an access requirement to a public place? If the General Assembly was contemplating, you can't require the following things as a mandate before someone can have access to the courthouse, but the following things you may require.
I think that county commissioners would definitely want to be engaged in that discussion.
Sure.
I'm not sure that there would be true resistance. It would just be a concern, because once again that speaks to our philosophical position about home rule. Sure. And our idea being that as the owners and maintainers of at least county properties, that it is within our constitutional, our local constitutional right to control and protect those properties and do that in a way that makes sense for our communities. What makes sense in Fulton County does not necessarily make sense in Toombs County. So I think that the county commissioners would be concerned merely in that aspect only, but would certainly be willing to come to the table and provide input as to so how we can make legislation in that fashion flexible enough for everybody to deal with.
And to your home rule question, I tell constituents all the time back home when they ask about our role, the General Assembly establishes a playing field, and it's up to the cities and the counties within the confines of the boundaries of that playing field to fill in the gaps and establish the details. I think what I'm looking at is understanding the differences in Toombs County and Fulton County. That we not write law for Fulton County, we not write law for Toombs County, but we set a playing field that's certainly puts a box around what may be appropriate, certainly a broad box, and I know that would be a desire, but a box nonetheless may need to be considered.
Right, and in that vein, I don't think there will be any resistance. I don't think that would be a problem. I think that they would be willing to come to you and engage and help you draw that box appropriately.
Okay. Before we go to anyone else, anyone on the committee, another question, Mr. Kimbrough? Anyone from the audience would like to speak briefly? Ms. Garrett.
I just have one quick statement. At the ACLU, we're, of course, strong advocates of privacy rights and strong advocates of the Open Records Act. I'm not so sure that there's as big of a gap in the Open Records Act as has been presented. If you look at 50-18-72A2, and I have not looked this over, and so I haven't looked at any case law, but it does exempt from disclosure medical information, vet records, and similar files. So I think that there can be an argument made that some of these biometrics may fall in that. I'm not sure why the county government would be collecting biometrics. That might actually be the more troubling issue, is them collecting biometrics to begin with, but I'm not so sure that there's a gaping hole there. And again, I'll have to look into that, and I'll contact Howard Manheimer from the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, who knows these things frontwards and backwards. But I just wanted to present that. And if there is a hole, I think it can be easily filled by just inserting the word biometrics rather than, completely rewriting the Open Records Act.
And I think that if I might be allowed to respond to that, I think that Ms. Garrett and her cohorts would be the first ones asserting the argument that any exemptions to the Open Records Act must be construed as narrowly as possible, and you cannot expand the words of the Open Records Act to fit your purposes and your needs. So, I respect what she says, but I certainly see where that would be the first argument they would make to say, no, you've got to give me this data, because it is not expressly exempted from the Act, and that is a standard that our courts have set.
Super. Mr. Kimbrough, if there's no further questions, you have nothing else for the committee, I'd thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Y'all have a wonderful evening.
I'd like to, in closing, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I think the camera's going to come back on and watch the closing of the committee. I will say the next formal meeting of this committee will be November 29th. That's going to be the closing meeting of this committee. I'll talk to the members about any discussions between now and then on subject matter. Any other questions from anyone in the audience regarding what we've discussed today? Hearing none, I'd like to hereby effectively close the meeting. Thank Ms. Nuremberg, our committee assistant, and MAG for sponsoring lunch today, Medical Association of Georgia. Folks, thank you for your time. Sometimes I want to go through and, even something as dry as Ken Kimbrough's presentation, he's an articulate guy, knows a lot. I want to make sure we know all the rocks. Yeah. It's important. What's your thoughts on this issue of public access? We didn't have anyone to really address it.